Recorded lecture for the first week of AVT 110 and AVT 180 at George Mason University. I guess we know we're in the right place because the syllabus for the course is right up on the screen. The screen is in Adobe InDesign. That's the last class, the last program we're going to look at this semester. But it does feature the Adobe interface, and with all the programs, you will see some similarity in that they tend to have a bunch of tools on the left side that you can use, and then a bunch of menus on the right side for how those tools work or for properties of the things you create. So a lot of times what you spend your time doing is making something and then going over to this side and figuring out how it's going to be colored or how it's going to interact with the objects above it or below it. We'll talk about that a bit more as we get into it. And then there's a bunch of information at the top, and this tends to change depending on what you are looking at. So if you have one kind of object, you'll see the information pertinent to that object, or if you're working with type, you'll see information pertinent to type, like size and space between lines and all that kind of stuff. But that's InDesign. What we're talking about first is Pinterest. What first is Illustrator. And I just read Pinterest off my syllabus. I do have some resources for some of my classes on Pinterest. So I'm going to start out by launching Illustrator. And there are two ways to do that. One, you could just go to your Launchpad if you're on a Mac. If you're on a PC, there are similar approaches. And then you can just, we went too far. Or we didn't go far enough. There's Illustrator, and I could just click on this and launch it, but I use Illustrator all the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it into my dock. So once it's in your dock, it's there, and you can just click on it when you want to launch it. And so it does its excited little dance as it's launching. It shows you its splash screen. That was created in Illustrator with vectors. The vectors I showed you in the first lecture were all pretty simple, but the vectors can get quite complex and layered. There are people who work with vectors and they do scenes that look very naturalistic. So I am capturing part of my screen. So let me pull Illustrator into part of the screen that is being captured so you can see the whole thing. And this is how it opens up. If you have other projects you've been working on, and here's a bunch of stuff I've done over the years. Most of these are, over the last weeks, most of these are not, well, none of these are a complete project by themselves, with the possible exception of that one. These are like little pieces that used here and there for other things. And I am logged in the Creative Cloud, and so that's my little identity photo. And I am going to create a new document. So I'm just going to say create new. And when you create a new document, it's tempting to just click on the first one, and you can do that. But there are a lot of options here for different things. So, for example, if you are doing video art, there are standard sizes for video screens, video formats. There are standard sizes for print, which includes letter and legal and tabloid. There are standard sizes for web. You're designing a responsive website, and there are mobile sizes as well. I'm a print designer, so I tend to use print quite a bit. And the nice thing about Illustrator, which is less true of some of the other programs, is it's really easy to resize it after you create it. You can create a document, and then if it turns out it's not the size you want, it's not too hard to just redo it. So I'm going to hit create just for a letter size page, and it takes a minute to come up. And when you bring it up in your program, this is probably what you will see, but you'll see extra stuff on the side, and you will see your primary tools, and we're just going to look at a few of these this week. And you will see that you are, and we are, probably all in the Essentials Workspace. The Essentials Workspace, the thing about these programs, and this is all of them, is the way they get people to, before the subscription system, the way they got people to buy the new version of the program, lay out money for it, is they would introduce new features. And so there would always be new features, and if you wanted whatever the cool new feature was, you had to update the program. And so eventually the program became bloated for that reason, or all these programs became fairly big and complex for that reason. The other reason they became big and complex is because they research who is using the software in different sorts of ways. So, for example, even though a graphic designer might use Photoshop in just really kind of basic ways, and an illustrator might use Photoshop in a different way, and an interior designer might use Photoshop in a different way. But there are suites of tools that are useful to all these different sorts of users. And so even when you get really good at the program, it may be that there is only a small subset of these tools that you will be using, and you'll still be fairly competent and able to do your job happily. And of course, in this class, unlike the other version, we are going to be focusing on those tools that are most useful to a graphic designer. Now, the Essentials Workspace, and all of these programs have multiple workspaces, is just one workspace. And in fact, you can see here I have a Jando space. I've created a custom space for me that has some tools that are not in any of these sort of basic workspaces. But I recommend that you pick, I would say, painting as your workspace, as it's just a little bit more robust, gives you a little bit more options, and just gives you access to a few more tools. But for today, if you want to keep it in Essentials, you can. But I will switch this to painting, and you could see that it has given me easier access to a whole bunch of other stuff, including a color spectrum, a few swatches. If you have a color that you know you like, you can create a swatch and you can have that swatch available to you. And because it's painting, it also has brushes. So I'm going to look at a few tools. The first one is just the basic shape tool. And you'll find that if you click on a tool, especially if it has this little triangle, this little tick mark in the corner, if you click on any of these tools, you'll often find, click and hold, come on, there we go, you'll find that there are other similar tools below them. So if I just start with this rectangle tool, I can draw a rectangle, and everything can have a stroke around it, and by default InDesign gives you a 1-point black stroke around its boxes, and it also gives you by default a white fill. And so we can see that in two places on my workspace. Over in swatches, you can see it is white. It's both white in there, and the white one is highlighted. And if we click the stroke comes to the front, and that's a little bit clunky, but that's pretty consistent across the Creative Suite. Then we see that it is a black stroke, but that stroke could be any color. I could make it a red stroke, or I could just pick a color from this color field and it becomes a green stroke. And the same is true of the fill. I can select the fill, and it's white right now, but I can make it a red fill or a fill that is any color. And you'll see that this is just converting to like a little eyedropper, and that's pretty universal across the Creative Suite too, to tell me that that is the color I'm selecting. And we can just do any of those colors to that shape. Now, if you want access to one of the other shapes, there's the ellipse, and we can draw an ellipse. And the way this works is Illustrator if I've selected some attributes, Illustrator will just assume that those are the new default attributes. And so it will make it pink like the other one. But I can make this any color as well, and it doesn't affect the last one. These are separate objects. Now, I am moving. One of the bad habits of doing this so many years is I sometimes don't always completely explain what I'm doing. But I have just selected my black arrow tool, and there are two arrow tools here, and we'll talk about both of them. But the black arrow tool is essentially for moving objects around. So I can move this object anywhere by just clicking and then dragging it to where I want it to be. Now, one of the things you'll note is that the green oval is on top of the pink object. So the computer is thinking about these kind of as a stack of objects. Each one of these is stacked, and if I continue to make objects, it's going to continue to stack those objects in the order I make them. So this time I'm going to make another oval, but this time I'm also going to hold down my shift key. And what my shift key does is it constrains the proportions so that my oval now has to be a perfect circle. And let's make that a different color, and we can see that pretty clearly that stacking order is consistent. I have moved this to the front of it's in the front of the other objects. It does not have to be. Now I just realized outside of my screen, which is a little bit unfortunate, outside of my recording area. But if you're working along with me, or if you open up Illustrator, you will see that there is a object drop-down menu. Oh, and there it is. So we can see that part of it. And under Object, we can the trouble is there are key commands for everything, and so sometimes I find I have a little bit of trouble finding what I'm looking for. Oh, here it is at the top, arrange. So you could say, you'll see it here says bring to front, send to back, or bring forward, or send backward. And so if I send this backwards, it goes back one object, and it is now behind. It's now the middle object. So even though I created this object last, it can be in any order in the stack, but you just have to go to your object, arrange, and then we could just say send it to back, range, and then we could say bring to front. And one of the things is this can get, if you have a whole bunch of objects, we only have 3 objects here, but when you get a whole bunch of them, it can get a little bit tedious sending things back and forth. And so the other thing to know about, and I don't expect you to do any of this, but under arrange, you'll see that there is a key command for all of this. And sometimes that, learning those key commands can make you more efficient. It's probably not necessary for this class, but in the future, just know if you find yourself doing something over and over and over again, this is shift, and that would be your control button if you use PC, or your command button on a Mac, and then your open bracket is what sends it to the front and back. And so it's kind of convenient that those are there, because if you do something over and over again, you can use the command. And so there are commands that I use so often that I just do them naturally all the time. And then there are things that, I don't do that often, but maybe I have to do a bunch of it once a year. And so those are the commands I don't necessarily have memorized, but then for that day I'll memorize it because I'm doing one thing over and over again a bunch of times, and so that just makes life a little bit easier. So let's look at our arrow tool again. This one is for moving objects around. We can also grab the handle and we can resize any of these objects with that arrow. But we can't access the actual points that these are made with. Let me just draw one star. And for that, you need this white arrow. So with this white arrow, and this can be confusing because I have my white arrow and I am moving this whole thing around, but I'm not really moving the object in the same way. I mean, the effect is the same, but what I'm doing is I am moving all the points, because all these points are dark in color, and that tells me they're selected. So if I click off this object and I click on it again, I can click on one of these points, and then you'll notice that the others all turned white, and just this point is selected. And I can move this one around independently, or I could select that one and I can move that one around independently, because these are just straight line segments that are attaching to make this shape. And the same is true of the circle. And by the way, that constraint trick works on rectangles too. If I hold down my shift key, I get a perfect square rather than a rectangle. Let's select this circle. And again, you see all the points are selected. But if I select this point, I get that point. And the difference is that this point has a handle. And I think of these handles as little magnets that are pulling the curve to make the curve. And this point does not have a handle. It's just the point. And you can manipulate those. If you want to mess around with this, you can. It's not a requirement. We'll talk about how to draw any shape you want next week. But you can pull out these handles and it distorts the curve. And the day I learned how to use Bezier curves, that's what these are called, these curves, after the mathematician who came up with the theory of them, is, it just gave me a massive headache. But it does, I mean, literally, I was just, after a day messing with these things, my head was pounding. But it does give you incredible power to work with objects and get what you want and draw what you want, or design a typeface, because those are all based on these kinds of curves. But for this week, you don't have to worry about those. Now, there are a couple of ways to manipulate these shapes that so you can get a shape that is more complicated. And one of them is the suite of Pathfinder tools. So I am going to, this is part of the painting workspace, and here is Pathfinder. And there are other ways to do this as well, but I'm just going to start out. This is sort of the original way that Illustrator gave you to do this. But you can take two shapes, for example, and you can merge them. So this is the merge button. You can see it looks sort of like two shapes merged. And I merged them, and they come together. And they are can't have two different colors. They're just one object. Well, they can have they can have what looks like multiple colors. That's a little bit advanced for today. But what happens is whatever object is topmost, the second one will take on that color. So we can bring this object to the top, and this time I'm just going to use the key command for that. Oh, it already is at the top because it was drawn later. And I can merge those by selecting them both with my arrows. Just click and click, and then combine them, and they take on the color of the topmost object. If we sent this to the back, I'm going to use the key command that time for this, then I can merge them and they become the top color again. You can also take bytes out of an object, and that's also a case where the top object is always going to take a byte out of the other one. So let's bring this to the front again. And so we can select them both, and I can take a chop out of that object if I want. Now, I do lose the object in the process. There are ways, if you explore some of these other buttons, there are ways of sort of combining them or without losing the original. But these are all the Pathfinder buttons, and they're all used for shape. So we could also do exclusion, and we can get where those two shapes overlapped. So there are ways of getting more complexity, and you could even imagine, let's say I wanted to draw a car. Just holding my shift key. Actually, I want these wheels the same size, so I'm going to delete that big wheel, and I'm going to grab this one, and I'm going to hold down my Option, or I think Alt on a PC, and if I drag it, I get a copy. So now what I can do is just select all these shapes by drawing a marquee over them, just taking my mouse and drawing over all of them. I just undid that. And then I can meld them all at once into one shape. Then if I want to give this car a window, and another window. So let's grab these two shapes first. And there goes my one window. And let's see if that shape remained on top. There goes my other window. So now I have like a little shape, and I have actually a fairly complex object here. And the other thing about this is I now have what is called a compound shape, so that if I pull it down here, we see those other shapes I drew through the window. Those are literally holes in this shape. So I'm going to show you two more things today, and then I'm going to give you your fairly simple assignment for this week, which will be in Illustrator. And I should say that if you have experience with Illustrator and you want to use other tools, or you know about other things you can do, that's absolutely fine. But for those who are brand new to Illustrator, this is, believe me, plenty for your first week. So let's just do one other thing. Another way to manipulate a shape is to give it what is called an envelope distort. So I'm here going to Object again, and this time I'm going to Envelopes Distort, and I'm just going to do a basic Make with Warp. And this gives you a bunch of options. And we're seeing previews in real time. And this is just something that can be fun to play with, but it's also something that can be useful. And then this drop-down gives you the basic contours of the shape it's going to give you. And then this just helps you define what direction and how much you want it to distort. So what I'd like you to do is just start with some basic shapes and play with the Pathfinder and the Distort tool a little bit. And just play with these. You know, it really doesn't matter. Just get a little bit of a feeling for them. And then one other thing I'm going to show you today is that, I got my little tutorial come up, which we do not need. And then the other thing I was going to show you is you can sometimes give these objects effects that help them interact with other objects. So let me take my car. Again, this is outside my recording area, for which I apologize, but you can see the drop-down menu. And I am going to go to just sort of basic effects. Or no, it's stylized. It's called effects in the other program. I should say that most of these tools, when we get into Photoshop, you won't be learning these tools over and over again because they work the same way in in the other program, and that's true of InDesign as well. But there are a few like annoying differences between the program and nomenclature, and Illustrator has long used the word effect for something else. So we have effect gallery in Photoshop. So here it's stylize, and I can give it a drop shadow. And I would say this is the least intuitive of, you could give anything a drop shadow in any of the programs. Let me just turn on my preview. It just takes a minute to draw that out. So we see it has a little shadow that is caught not just by the background, but by the other shapes that are behind it. I could say OK. And so let's give this another stylization, stylize, and I'll just call it let's just try the inner glow. And here is my menu. I'm just going to hit preview again, and can make this go from the center to the edge. Let's just make that a little bit bigger. And I can also make it lighter or darker with the opacity. And I will say, okay. So your assignment for this first week, which we will talk about at our first critique next week, and I will also prepare a little, I have not prepared it yet, but you'll have it by the time of our first meeting, is an assignment sheet that basically repeats what I'm going to say here, is I want you to create a simple collage in Illustrator using the pathfinder and the warp tool. Ideally, I'd like that collage to have one identifiable object in it, and it could be a crude car, just as crude as mine, but something that elicits some sort of look or another. And I'd like you to play with the warp tool a little bit as part of that collage. And the effects are optional, but if you want to add a little bit of depth to your collage, just know that shadows and things like glows can make something a little bit more complex, even though the shapes themselves are very simple. So I will be taking any questions about this assignment when we meet on our class day. And so that's just it, is to do a little collage, mostly abstract, but with one recognizable object, and that it explores the shapes and explores the pathfinder a little bit, so you get a little bit comfortable in working with these shapes. So that is the end of my second lecture for this week, and we will, I'm very much looking forward to meeting you at the first class.